Good afternoon from Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. Well, in the stimulus bill, we've seen that there's going to be a proposed $15 minimum wage. So today, we're very special to have Dr. Dana Stryk, former professor of economics from George Washington University, to sit down with us and talk about the minimum wage. Well, back in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed by Congress, and it represented a major shift in labor policy. For the first time, the federal government set a minimum wage and established the principles that people, or at least those covered by the law, are entitled to at least a certain amount of pay for their work. Since the first federal minimum wage was set in 1938, it's been raised 22 times by 12 different presidents. One reason that the federal minimum wage provokes such a continuous controversy is that it doesn't automatically adjust to the rise of cost of living. So, Dr. Stryk, why do we have the minimum? Well, first off, welcome.
Why, thank you. Great fan of the show. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. So why does the minimum wage exist?
So the minimum wage is a price floor. And what a price floor does is it establishes the legal minimum price that can exist in a market, in this case, the labor market. Although there are certain segments of the labor market that are excluded from the minimum wage, for the most part, most of us who have a job, our job is subject to minimum wage, except that for most people, your actual wage rate is above the minimum wage. So there is a segment of the population that for $7.75 an hour, without the minimum wage, they would make less. Now, why they would make less is a point or a topic for another day. But at the end of the day, what the minimum wage means is that policymakers decided back in 1938 and have continued to do so that the wage without the minimum wage is too low. So it is a public policy decision. So we have decided as a government that we want people who are hourly workers to earn at least $7.75 an hour.
Well, since this is a policy change and not necessarily driven truly by economics, there's going to be winners and losers. And what I've been told is that the mom and pop shops are going to close down, and that people who make the current minimum wage probably shouldn't make $15 an hour, and that basically everybody's not going to be able to buy as much as they used to. So what would be the argument from an economics perspective?
As with every government policy or public policy, there are going to be winners and losers. So in this case, who's going to win from an increase in the minimum wage from $7.75 to $15 an hour? Well, it's obvious. If you were somebody who was making $14.99 an hour or less, you're going to be better off if you keep your job. And estimates by the Congressional Budget Office are that increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025 will increase the income of 17 million workers. However, there also are losers. And those losers, you can imagine, are some of those people that currently have jobs at $7.75 or $10 an hour or whatever, and they're going to find themselves unemployed. So within the labor market, we have both winners and losers. Keep in mind that the argument for the minimum wage isn't that they're being paid how productive they are. It's more that we want to make it a living wage. We want to make it something somebody can actually, raise a family and things like that.
Well, some of my more progressive viewers will tell me that having the minimum wage where it's at is almost immoral. So how much truth is that? I mean, how many families are out there trying to make a living at $7.75 an hour?
So within, when you look at labor market statistics, there's a group of workers that are considered low-wage workers, and that is anyone who makes $19 or less an hour. So even $15 an hour is still considered a low wage. That's 31% of people who are working. One thing to know about the increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour, so it's going to make those families better off, and it's going to lift an estimated 1.5 million households out to above the poverty line. And so without a doubt, if you have that job, you're going to be better off. However, there are some issues here for small business owners and for you and me who aren't employed in minimum wage jobs, yet it's going to impact us as well.
All right, so that brings up a interesting thought that just popped in my head. When you and I were 17, 18 years old, I know you worked as a bank teller. I did all kinds of odd jobs, and we kind of cut our teeth on how to deal with customers, how to deal with fellow employees. I mean, that's just not something that you naturally get as a youth. Isn't there some value to that? And should they actually be paid $15 an hour for that? I mean, should a 17-year-old get $15 an hour, or should they get $7 an hour and learn how to eventually make $15 an hour?
So if we open up an econ textbook and we look at something about the labor market, what it's going to say is that for the most part, that the wage rate that you are paid is somewhat related to your productivity and the value of what you produce. So for example, I could be really productive at producing, something, but if it's not sold for a really high price, the firm's not going to be able to or willing to pay me a lot of money. And so without a doubt, the fact that if you are working at a minimum wage job, it does say that the way that the market values the value of what you produce is lower than the minimum wage. So that teenager flipping burgers at McDonald's, which is a common thing that's said, is going to be paid $15 an hour. And you know what? That is true. That is a very small proportion of people who have minimum wage jobs. And so yes, there are going to be some people that, quote, don't need it. They're not heads of households. They're not, and they're gonna move on to more higher paying jobs. But at the end of the day, this is about a living wage. And while $15 an hour doesn't exactly get a lot of consensus among all economists, what all economists would say is that $10 an hour generates minimal impact on unemployment, yet can help lift some people out of poverty. $15 would be a shock to the system. And maybe that's what our system needs.
It's kind of funny. I did some research and I found out that McDonald's workers, their actual pay somewhat averages between $9 and $13. So in some places, $15 is not going to be that big of a jump. All right. So, the purpose of this channel is to talk about Lichtman's keys and how is this going to affect Biden over the next 4 years. So does $15 of an hour minimum wage, will that actually affect either the short-term or the long-term economy?
The first thing to know is the $15 an hour comes into play after the election. So we'll be in the ramp up to it. And
So
I would say overall, 2025
Okay.
is when it comes into play. And so if we look at just a broad brush of how the winners and losers. So I know that if I have a job and it's minimum wage job, I'm going to be better off. I'm going to be thrilled. I'm going to think the economy is doing really, really well. Boom. There's a segment that's going to be unemployed. I'm not going to be happy. I don't think the economy is doing well. I'm going to put thumbs down. There are other people. So you or I are going to see some inflation. This is going to make stuff cost more. But estimates are it's a really negligible effect. It is like 0.1%. So but probably something that we won't even notice. Overall, I don't think it's going to have a huge I don't think it would affect either key from from the entire overall country level, regionally or state by state, perhaps if there's a lot of people that are minimum wage jobs, but I don't see this having a huge impact on flicking those economic keys. But the thing is, $15 an hour, it's doubling the existing minimum wage. This thing is huge if it's passed.
From an economics perspective, doesn't affect. However, from a policy perspective, this could be a very big domestic policy win for the Biden administration.
Absolutely. And just before any other economists are like, what do you mean it's not going to have any? It'll have minimal effect macro overall, but it would definitely be a big win in terms of a major policy implementation.
I meant as far as the economic keys.
Yes, the economic keys, right.
Right. So any parting shots, any thoughts before we sign off here?
One thing well, of course, I have one more thing to say. You and I have talked about this, which was an analogy to help people wrap their heads around some of the cascading effects of a minimum wage, which is the story of the car wash.
Yes.
And which I think encapsulates everything. So if you imagine that you go in to get your car washed,
Well,
and
real quick background. New York City passed a $15 minimum wage, and it had a huge impact on the car wash industry within New York to where the point that I think all but 3 have shut down. Why is that?
well, let's think about everybody more than likely has had their car washed, whether it is the local high school band trying to raise money or Mr. Wash or something like that. And so if I own a car wash, there are sort of two different ways I can go. I can hire a lot of labor. They're going to have buckets and mops or not mops, but sponges and a hose and some soap and things like that. Or I could have maybe 1 or 2 people who operate a machine that pulls my car in and washes it. So 2 different ways. I want to do the thing as the car wash owner that's the most productive for me, right? That generates the most profit, most profitable for me. So if I'm the first one that has a lot of labor and all of a sudden my labor bill goes up, in fact, I have no idea how much car washers in New York made prior to the minimum wage increase to $15 an hour, but let's say they're making $7.75. I've just doubled my labor costs. So I have a couple options. Option number 1 is maybe I can just pass my costs on immediately to you, the consumer. And so that would be, the first case, it could cause some inflation if I'm able to push it off onto you. Number 2 is I make enough money that I can just sort of suck it up and pay the higher cost. Probably not likely. The other is I'm going to start firing some of my workers, and that's hence the increase in unemployment. Or number 3, I get rid of most of my workforce and I go get that piece of capital equipment. And which is actually what happened in New York, is a lot of them became very mechanized. And so there are a lot of, as you peel the layers back of the onion, it's not enough just to say, yes, it's good or bad. Remember, it has winners and losers. And you have to recognize that.
Well, that's awesome. So thank you very much for joining us. You willing to come back at the end of the week and talk about the stimulus bill?
Absolutely.
All right.
You know where to find me.
For those who don't know, Dr. Dana Stryk is actually I'm Mr. Dr. Dana Stryk. That's my wife, and she's dialing in from upstairs so we can do this correctly. All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching. If you have any questions for Dr. Dana Stryk, just drop them off in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button and hit those notifications so that you can get this in the future. And later on this week, we'll talk about the stimulus bill and some other things.